Mr Chairman.
John O'Naylor.
Yeah,
I move that the question be now put.
I'm going to indicate that I will take extra calls. I will reiterate a ruling that I've made previously, and that is where reasonable questions have been asked, and they should be responded to. And if they were responded to, then it's more likely a closure would be given. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that this particular part of the bill contains a clause which is quite unusual and with extreme powers to ministers and requires substantial debate. Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you. Mr Chair, I want to start my reflections on part one by referring back to the regulatory impact statement that applies to this bill. Because it sets out the objectives that the government hopes to achieve through this bill generally, and presumably through part one, in particular the transfer of powers that, that part one executes. And it states in the regulatory impact statement that Cabinet decided before drafting part one of this bill that it had an agreed set of objectives around social housing reform package that presumably this bill is intended to capture. And I really want to just compare whether or not in part one of this bill those objectives have indeed been captured. And it states that one of the first objectives was to ensure that people who need housing support can access it and receive social services that meet their needs. Sounds like a description of Housing New Zealand's objectives probably as it stands. This is, I would assume, the mandate as set out in the Housing New Zealand Act 1955. That was one of the relative stated objectives of that Act. So again, not different, not new, so moving right along. B, ensure that social housing is the right size, configuration and the right area for those households who need it. Again, one of the objectives of the Housing New Zealand Act 1955, which Part 1 amends, was about the acquisition of land in areas, of course, where there was need for the establishment of Housing New Zealand properties. So again, not a need to reform the Act there, just a reason to stick to the objectives of the 1955 Act. D was to encourage E was to help increase the supply of affordable housing, especially in Auckland. Not really something that this part particularly achieves at all, or that the government has indeed achieved with their agenda thus far. I guess my point is, Mr Speaker, that, Mr Chair, is that we are amending a principal act here significantly in order to supply a set of principles that actually the original act, if followed, would have been able to provide. So what is the real agenda behind the amendments that we see in Part 1? So I want to, Mr Speaker, reflect then on the amendments that we're making and to the original powers of the Minister that we are in fact changing. Because if you go back to the Housing Act 1955 and you look at the powers that the Minister has in the Act, it states the Minister may from time to time determine either generally or in any particular case what land or classes of land may be acquired for state housing purposes. The entire focus of the powers of the Minister in that original Act was about the acquisition, the development and the growth of Housing New Zealand properties. It was about building state housing stock. It was about ensuring that people's needs were met through acquisition. And now that what we're changing in this amendment in Part 1 is we are fundamentally depleting the idea that a primary role of that Minister is to build up that stock, but the idea of provision for the people who need it. Instead, we're turning it on its head and giving them the power to hock it off. That's essentially what we're doing. We are giving them the power, carte blanche, without many of the checks and balances that we would usually require. We're giving two ministers the absolute discrete power to hock it off. Now, by claiming that it's going to social housing providers, this seems to be a cover of sorts. But our point on this side of the House is shuffling around the decks on the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic does nothing to resolve the overall problem. And if you're simply passing around what stock you have, we are not fixing the dire situation. And I want to reflect very quickly on the impact of something like Part 1, because obviously the groundwork was laid quite early for this. In central Auckland, where there are high housing needs, we have examples of rough sleepers through the lack of emergency housing in central Auckland. You would think there would be a particular focus on the government to grow the housing stock as Part 1, as the Minister had the discretion to under the 1955 Act. You'd think that's what we would see. What do we see instead? When the Auckland Council started developing its unitary plan, Housing New Zealand contracted, Mr. Chair.
Jacinda, I do.
Housing New Zealand contracted, from memory it was Becker, to go through and make a submission to Auckland Council to remove protections on every single Housing New Zealand property. There were screeds and screeds of pages where Housing New Zealand had contracted someone to independently go through and do things as small as remove the protections around the cone shaft views for Housing New Zealand houses. And they even did it in blocks of property where Housing New Zealand, for instance, owned one flat in a block of, say, 15 flats. They applied for those protections to be moved, even though they affected private landholders. And why would they do that? Why would Housing New Zealand have gone to that great expense to remove those protections? One reason: preparation for sale. The preparation to remove anything that might bring down the potential sale price for Housing New Zealand, to sell off the housing that they owned in those areas. Now, I've heard the argument time and time again, and this is what this bill is trying to imply, that we're just transferring that responsibility onto other providers. That is not what's happening. They are going into private ownership. We are not growing the stock that we need, and this bill allows that to happen at a much greater rate. Mr. Speaker, I have another quick example that I just wanted to reflect on, which this bill will make even more acute. And that is, and this is not to discount the role of community housing, but to demonstrate some of the silly decisions that are being made. A street in the area that I work across called Spring Street is currently houses, from my recollection, up to 40 pensioners in that area. Now, anyone who knows Auckland knows that we have a problem with a lack of pensioner housing, significant, particularly since John Banks went a little bit crazy and sold a whole lot of it off. So Spring Street has a number of units owned by Housing New Zealand. It is, of course, very valuable land. So Housing New Zealand decided that they wanted to sell that land to a private provider. Now, not a provider, sorry, developer. They just wanted to sell it. Now, of course, that got the local community up in arms. What a silly thing to do. Where are we going to put the pensioners who access services in the central city currently and have lived for a long period of time in these purpose-built pensioner flats? So the response from Housing New Zealand: we will make sure that when we tender out to those private developers, that they have to retain the same number of units to be available for Housing New Zealand purposes. So the end outcome that Housing New Zealand was proposing was to sell the land, lease back the same number of units at considerable cost, and then have a private developer bank the amount that they make from further developing the land and selling off additional units as part of the transfer of that land. How does the New Zealand taxpayer end up benefiting out of such a short-term decision? Now, if you wanted to develop Spring Street, sure. If you wanted to put in a few more units, I can understand that. But to sell it in its entirety to a private developer and then have, in the longer term, Housing New Zealand paying out to that private developer for the same number of units, what a short-sighted, short-term decision. And that is exactly the thinking that is captured in this bill. We are not thinking about the long-term costs for New Zealanders of selling these assets. We are not thinking about the long-term ability of Housing New Zealand to provide for the needs that our community has. We're not thinking about how we can properly support the community sector to provide the houses they ultimately want to provide. That's not what this bill is factoring in, though. Of course we acknowledge the role they have to play. We want to support them to do that, but that's not what this bill is ideologically about. And I challenge Nick Smith to demonstrate, just use one example, to tell us how many additional Housing New Zealand properties in central Auckland, over and above the ones that are being sold, have been purchased since that minister's been in government. How many? Because I know how many you lease at great expense. I know how many you've sold at a great loss to taxpayers and at a great loss to the community. But all that minister's agenda has done has led to people who are currently in social housing being pushed out to the edges of Auckland, losing their community, losing their connections, and we no longer have mixed community housing. We're losing that at great rates, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's an ongoing agenda for that to continue. So, Mr. Speaker, overall, I'm extraordinarily disappointed in the concentration of power of Part 1.